Hello and welcome to episode 29 of the Abbasid History podcast, an audio platform to examine pre-modern Islamic history and a global medieval past. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihsc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHSC Bookshop for details. We're also sponsored by Turath Publishing. Listeners get 15% discount on all purchases. Visit Turath Publishing at turath.co.uk and use discount code POD15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact Turath Publishing for details. I'm your host, Talha Hassan, a PhD student at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Now onto the show. Literally meaning speech, word, utterance, among other things, Kalām, or philosophy of religion within the Islamic ecumene, has divided Muslim believers about its scope, methods, and even its validity in itself. To give us today a brief history of Kalām is the presenter of a new podcast devoted to explaining Kalām to the uninitiated, Dr. Hannah Erlwein. Dr. Erlwein completed a PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies on arguments for the existence of God in classical Islamic thought, which is now published, and she is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science in Berlin. Welcome, Dr. Erlwein.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here on your podcast.
The term Kalām appears in the formative Abbasid period of early Islamic doctrine. What is the socio-political and intellectual cultural context of its birth and development?
I think it's very good that you're asking about the context in which Kalām emerged, because when you look at the different theories academics have proposed of the origins of Kalām, you will see that despite certain differences in them, they all emphasize that we need to look precisely at the historical context in order to understand the emergence. And so maybe what we could say is there's different theories, as I said. Some of them focus more on what we could call external factors that gave rise to the science of Kalām. Others focus more on internal factors. And actually, divergence is also due to the fact that, unfortunately, we don't have many very early sources. I mean, Kalām texts that they basically haven't come down to us. So it's a bit difficult to construct or reconstruct the emergence of Kalām. But so what we could say about the religious, intellectual, and so on social context is that we need to look at the beginnings of the expansion of the Muslim empire. So obviously, after the death of the Prophet, the Muslim empire expanded and lots of different territories were conquered and so on. And so obviously Muslims came into contact with other faiths, such as Christians, for example. And in the academic literature, this encounter with the Christians has been emphasized, and it is said that this encounter played quite an important role in the emergence of Kalām. So, for example, one thing you will find is that among Christians, you already had something like a theology. So there were theologians who were debating with each other about questions such as Jesus, human and divine nature, and so on. And they used a certain debating style, which was basically a question-answer format. So they would imagine a hypothetical interlocutor who would ask questions, and this gave the theologian the opportunity to reply to that. And so it is said in these theories about the emergence of Kalām that Muslims basically adapted this debating style in order to discuss their own theological questions. And as you said earlier, the word Kalām, which is the term that denotes the science of Islamic theology, basically means nothing else than debate or conversation. And so academics have proposed that this name is also taken from this characteristic debating style that, as I said, characterized theological debates among Christians. But I think what we can say generally is that, of course, as I said, when the empire expanded, Muslims came into contact with all kinds of other faiths. And these encounters really did contribute to the emergence of Kalām. So another example that we could think of is when you look at the writings of one early theologian, so 10th century theologian by the name of Maturidi. So he lived in Central Asia, in Samarkand and these kind of cities. And so what you will find when looking at his work is that a lot of his theological debates are against dualistic religions, so Manichaeans, Zoroastrians, and so on. And so what he tries to show is that their conception of God or the divine or how the world came about and these kind of things is basically wrong. So what this shows us is that in Maturidi's case, for example, the development of theological debate was very much sparked by these encounters with other religions and other faiths. But as I said, some of the theories also propose that we don't actually have to look for only external influences, but that we can also look within the Islamic tradition itself and focus a bit more on internal developments. But that's the same point, that basically you need to look at the social, religious, and so on context in order to understand how theological debate came about. I mean, first of all, we can say that maybe it's not surprising that Muslims would start discussing the theological problems they found in the Quran. So that's quite self-evident. But another situation or context in which theological debates arose was, in the beginnings of Islam, there were lots of revolts happening, and it was quite a troubled time for the early Muslim community. And so, for example, one very important theological problem which is the question of who is a believer? When, according to which criteria can you call somebody a believer? This specific debate actually arose in the specific context of these internal struggles, sectarianism, civil wars, and these kind of things. Another example, the last one I could give, is one early theological group by the name of the Qadariya. They put a special emphasis on the doctrine of human free will and responsibility for one's actions. And so with them, the interesting thing is that their theological doctrines, or the formulation of their theological doctrines, actually went hand in hand with their political opposition to the Umayyad regime, because basically they felt that the Umayyads were not proper legitimate rulers and that they were not ruling the Muslim community in a proper way. And so here you can see how their emphasis on a theological problem, namely responsibility for one's actions and free will, basically was linked to this political context of opposition to the ruling elite.
The practitioner of Kalām is known as a mutakallim. Tell us about some notable figures in the tradition.
Yeah, so I think it's very difficult to pick a few of them, because you can imagine Kalām is a very rich tradition and obviously developed over quite a few centuries. So there would be loads of candidates that could be really interesting to look at. But maybe I could pick, for the purpose of illustration, one of them, an early theologian by the name of Ash'ari. He was also, like Maturidi, a 10th century theologian. And he's quite an important figure. I'm sure that many people will already have heard of him. So his significance in Islamic intellectual history is that he became the founder of one very important theological school, which was called after him, the Ash'ariya. And another reason why he's very important is that he, as a theologian, tried to formulate what we could call something of a middle position between two, let's call them extreme positions, in a debate about reason versus revelation. So it was a debate taking place back then about the question, what are the sources from which theological knowledge can be derived? And so on the one hand, you had one group, which is called the Mu'tazila, who very much put an emphasis on reason. And then on the other extreme, you had the followers of a certain figure called Ahmad ibn Hanbal. Usually they're called traditionalist scholars, who put more emphasis on the role of revelation in answering theological problems. So these Hanbalites, they believed that basically reason wasn't a good tool or a good way of finding answers to theological problems. And so Ash'ari's significance is that he tried to find a middle position between the two of them. So he wanted to emphasize that reason does play an important role in theological questions, but also, of course, revelation does. And maybe I can give you one quick example to illustrate what this meant. So the Mu'tazilis, these theologians who put so much emphasis on reason, they said, for example, when it comes to the problem of the divine attributes, okay, maybe I should start the other way around. So there is a theological problem, which is the divine attributes. So, the Quran talks about God's attributes, and especially it uses certain, or speaks about certain attributes that are anthropomorphizing, so that they describe God by using terms that actually we know basically from humans, such as God's face or God's hands and so on. And so these Mu'tazilis, who put so much emphasis on reason, they said, well, what reason tells us is that God certainly is not like humans. So whenever the Quran talks about God's face and hands, reason tells us that we have to understand these as a metaphor. We definitely cannot take them literally. So what the Quran means when it speaks about God's face is, for example, his grace, or when it talks about his hands is his power and so on. So this is how they said that reason is the arbiter of religious problems or theological problems. And as I said, on the other side, you had these more traditional scholars who said that reason isn't really the arbiter of these questions, and we basically just have to look at revelation. So they said, well, basically, we don't even engage in trying to figure out what precisely the Quran means when it says that God has a face or God has a hand. All we're doing is saying Scripture speaks about God's face and God's hands, so we are using these expressions as well, but we're definitely not engaging in questioning what is meant by this. And now comes in Ash'ari. So Ash'ari followed the Mu'tazilis by saying, we will engage in this question. And one thing reason can tell us for sure is that God is not like creation. So it's definitely the case that God's hand is not literally a hand as we know it from humans. But he followed the traditional scholars in saying, well, reason definitely cannot tell us what precisely it then means. And so he developed this middle position that is known as the bila kayf doctrine, which it's Arabic, bila kayf means without asking how. So he said, we know it's not to be taken literally, but we're not giving an answer of what precisely these things mean. And so, as I said, this was the position Ash'ari developed. And so in intellectual history of Islam, he's actually a really important personality. And also he, as I said, became associated with the theological school that's still considered like orthodox, basically.
The Islamic scholastic tradition across different schools has a culture of texts, commentaries, supra-commentaries, and summaries. And this is helpful to trace genealogies of thought. Tell us about the contents of the earliest extant Kalām works and subsequent texts.
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about the contents of these Kalām works, we have to first of all keep in mind what the aim was of Kalām, or the science of Kalām, or these Kalām works. And so what we need to be clear about is that they were trying to put religious dogma on a rational foundation. I already alluded to that. So basically what they were saying is that we cannot just accept religious dogma because some authority tells us that we have to believe it or so on, but we have to scrutinize religious dogma and try to present proof for it. So what this of course means is that what we find in these Kalām works is discussions pertaining to the most important religious tenets. And so I think another thing that's very important to keep in mind is that even though Islamic theology was, of course, all about religious dogma, this does not mean that every single issue that was discussed in Kalām works was in itself a religious problem. So what I mean by this is, when we're taking a few examples, so for example, traditionally, these Kalām works, they're open with discussions about what knowledge actually means. So they're trying to find a definition of knowledge. They're trying to ask questions about how do humans actually attain knowledge? What kind of arguments are there? What is the proof? And so on. When you think about this, I mean, this is a topic that's not in itself a religious question. It's just a general question about epistemology, and it's definitely relevant for all sorts of, sciences and so on. The same is the case by discussions that followed, the discussions about knowledge and proofs and so on, which is the question of what is the world made of? What does the world consist of? What is the stuff the world is made of? And so theologians were discussing atoms and accidents that come together to form bodies and these kind of things. And here we have the same point, that this is a question about the ontology of the world that is not in itself a religious problem. I could give other examples, such as when theologians were discussing the ontology of good and evil. So they were asking, for example, are things evil and good because they are intrinsically like this? Or what is the reason that things are called morally blameworthy and morally good and so on? But important thing about these discussions is that since they all appeared in the context of Kalām, of Islamic theology, they all, of course, have a relevance for theology. So as I said, this example with the discussion, for example, about of what is the world made of and so on. In consequence, it was, of course, a religious problem because it led theologians to discussions of how do we know that God is the creator of the world, and what can we tell or what can we infer about God's attributes based on looking at the world. And so, yeah, of course, besides these problems they were discussing that are not in itself or in themselves religious problems, I guess there's also quite a few issues in these Kalām works being discussed there where it's quite evident that they're basically a theological or religious problem. Like I mentioned earlier, the discussion about the definition of belief and unbelief, or for example, another topic was the problem of human agency and God's agency, or what I just mentioned, all these very important discussions about God's nature and God's attributes.
What do you feel is the enduring legacy of medieval Kalām for our world today? And where should listeners turn to next for more information?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think the answer will depend on what one is looking for or what one is interested in. So I think obviously for a believer nowadays, Kalām can still be a source of, where they can feel like they can defend their faith, or they can try and understand their faith. They can try and understand why they believe the things they do. Because as I said, Kalām is it's basically an exposition of religious dogma. But I think even for people who are not believers or adherents of Islam, Kalām can actually be really, really interesting. And I think one reason is that it's quite insightful in terms of the intellectual history of the Islamic tradition. I mean, this is also the reason I'm very much interested in studying Kalām. And what I personally find most interesting about it is that I think reading Kalām and these Kalām discussions is really an exercise in critical thinking. And I find this very exciting because, as I said earlier, the whole aim of the science of Kalām was to place a religious dogma on a rational foundation. And as I said, the assumption that basically underlay all this was that it's not good enough to just accept a belief or conviction because some authority like your parents or some religious leaders and so on tell you that apparently it is right. But these Mutakallimun said that you need to have a good reason, and good reason for them meant providing proof for it. And so I think this is something that is still relevant nowadays, and not only when it comes to religious questions, but I think actually in many areas of life. You could even say in politics, like why should you just subscribe to some political worldview? I think even there you could say, why do I believe what I believe? Why do I think a certain form of government is the right one? And so, as I said, I think what Kalām can teach us is that it is worthwhile to question one's assumptions and to try and provide for oneself and also others good reasons of why a certain belief should be accepted. So as for your question, where one should look if one is interested in learning more about Kalām. So maybe I could recommend actually reading a primary source, which fortunately has been translated. And this would be a text by Al-Ash'ari, who I mentioned earlier. He was that founder of one of the theological schools. And so his text is entitled A Vindication of the Science of Kalām, and it has been translated by Richard McCarthy. It's not a very long text, it's just a few pages, but it is so interesting because, as the title says, what Ash'ari tries to do in this text is to defend the validity of the science of Kalām and rational speculation about religious dogma against these more traditional scholars who basically said that it is innovation and that one should not engage in Kalām. And so this letter he wrote, or this epistle, is basically, as I said, an exercise in critical thinking. He tries to provide all sorts of arguments for why Kalām is actually worthwhile and why Muslims should engage in it and why it is a legitimate enterprise and why these opponents of Kalām are wrong in objecting to it. So I think that could be a really interesting text to start with. But besides that, obviously, what one could look at is all these kind of companions that exist out there about Islamic theology, such as there's the Cambridge Companion to Classical Islamic Theology, which has been edited by Tim Winter. And these are quite useful because they provide nice introductory chapters to all the problems classical Islamic theologians discussed. So I think that would be a good starting point.
Kalamopod, a new podcast dedicated to the history of Kalām. Before you tell us more about that and other current projects that listeners can anticipate, tell us about your book, Arguments for the Existence of God in Classical Islamic Thought.
In my book, I engage with one majorly important discussion among classical Islamic theologians and also philosophers, which is basically a discussion about whether the world is eternal or whether it has come about in time. And related to this was the discussion whether God actually created the world, and if he did so, which according to all of them he did, in what way did he create the world? In what way, or what does it mean to say of God that he's a creator? And so what I'm doing in my book in a nutshell is that I'm basically mainly critiquing the academic literature on this classical Islamic discourse. So what I'm saying is that in the academic literature, there's quite a bit of literature that engages with these Islamic arguments for the creator, as they're called in Arabic. And so what you will find in the academic literature is that they're saying the purpose of these arguments was to prove God's existence. And what I'm suggesting in my book is that this is actually a misunderstanding of the purpose of these Islamic arguments. So I'm saying the purpose was not to prove that God exists, but they had a different purpose. And I'm suggesting in my book what this purpose is. So yeah, maybe I can say a few words where, in my opinion, the analysis by scholars in academia has gone wrong, but obviously I can only summarize it now. And you can imagine if one writes a whole book on a topic like this, that the arguments are much more complicated in reality and there are much more intricacies. So I could only hope that if the listeners would like to know more about the details of my argument, that they will actually turn to the book. But what I can maybe say is, so when you look at the Islamic arguments for the creator, as I said, what you will find is that what, for example, Muslim theologians do is that first in their works, they have a section where they're trying to prove that the world is originated in time. So as I said, their point is the world has not always existed, it has come about in time. And then in the following section, what they try to do is to show that the world, since it is originated, actually has an originator. And so in the academia, what scholars say is that, or the way they analyze these arguments is that they say these are cosmological arguments for God's existence. So they're using the terminology known from Western European philosophy in order to analyze these Islamic arguments. You know, cosmological argument is one of these different types of arguments. And so in their terminology, they actually follow Immanuel Kant's terminology. And actually, you will also find that they explicitly link their analysis of the Islamic arguments to arguments for God's existence in the Western tradition. So they're trying to say that we have a parallel discourse here. But I think there's a fundamental difference between the discourse and arguments for God's existence in the Western tradition and these arguments for the creator in the Islamic tradition. And this is what I'm trying to show in my book. And so I think, in the Western tradition, it is true that these cosmological arguments are used in order to prove that there's actually more than the world. So they're starting from the world and they're trying to show that there is actually another entity which has to exist in addition to the world by saying the world is created and therefore it must have a creator. And then they proceed to call this additional entity, which they have introduced into reality, so to say, they identify it with God and say, now we have proven God's existence. I know this is very simplified what I'm saying here, but I hope it becomes clear what I'm trying to get at. And so I think in the Islamic context, something else is happening. So they're also using what we could call cosmological arguments, which means they're starting, as I said, with the fact that the world is originated in time. But I think what's going differently here is that they're not using them in order to say there is more than the world, and thereby trying to introduce another entity in addition to the world. I think these Islamic thinkers took the fact of God's existence, so Allah's existence, for granted. So for them, I think they always assume that there's the world and that there's God. And so the purpose, in my view, of the arguments was to show that the world really is created by God, and that there really is a link between the world which has come about in time and God who made it. And as I said, the significance of this is, of course, also that they were very much engaged or interested more in question of like, in what sense is God a creator? I hope this kind of made clear where I think the difference is between these arguments in the Western context and then in the Islamic context. But as I said, I mean, there's much more to say about it. The only last thing I want to say is that, so when I'm saying in my book that there are no arguments for God's existence in the Islamic tradition, I'm thereby not trying to say that these Islamic scholars attempted to prove God's existence, but somehow they failed or that they presented bad arguments. This is not my point. My point is to ask, what is the purpose of these arguments we find in our primary sources? And is it really to prove God's existence? And I'm saying, no, it is not. And I think this is important for people who are interested in intellectual history, as I am, because obviously it is very fascinating to compare traditions with each other and ask the question, what differences are there between traditions, but also what similarities do they have? And of course, this has nothing to do with a value judgment or anything like this. It simply means saying we want to understand how people in a certain tradition thought about things. What were their concerns? What was at stake for them? And this is hopefully the contribution I was able to make with my book. All right, then you also asked me about my podcast. Yeah, thanks for bringing this up. So a few weeks ago, I started a podcast of my own, which is called Kalamopod. And I think it's quite evident by the name what the podcast is about. So it's taken from that name for the science of Islamic theology, Kalām. So it is a podcast on themes in classical Islamic theology. So the reason I started this podcast is basically that I find this whole study of classical Islamic theology very fascinating. And then I thought, maybe there are some people out there who might also be interested in that, and there isn't a podcast on this yet. I mean, a podcast that's completely dedicated to that. And so I thought, yeah, why not start a podcast on that? And of course, I would be very happy if maybe some of your listeners were interested in giving a listen to my own podcast and trying it out, and hopefully they enjoy it. Actually, what I could maybe quickly point out is, since I mentioned Al-Ash'ari quite a few times now in his letter or this epistle he wrote on the vindication of the science of Kalām. So the latest episode I uploaded, which is episode 4, is specifically dedicated to discussing this text written by Ash'ari. So I think that could be very interesting for listeners. Yeah, then you asked me about other projects. Well, when it comes to the Kalamopod, I'm actually also hoping to conduct some interviews in the future. So I can already take some inspiration from your interviews with your guests. But yeah, that will be hopefully in a few weeks' time. So I would like to also interview some scholars in the field and kind of get their views on certain issues that I'm discussing in my podcast. And yeah, I guess that's it for the moment. But let's see what other collaborations might be possible in the future.
Thank you for being a guest on the Abbasid History podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.